The other first eukaryotes that we think colonized land, probably a little bit before the first plants, would have been the fungi. So fungi are a group of organisms that are a force unto themselves. They are incredibly just astounding beings. But what is unique about them is that they are chemoheterotrophs, just like us, right? We eat other organisms to get both our carbon and our energy. But what's different about them and what makes them a key player for establishing life on land is that they have external digestion. So the way fungi eat, it's totally cool. They have very small, thin, thread-like extensions of their body that are all part of the same fungi that we call hyphae. And each thin thread is 1 cell thick, so huge surface area. But what they do is that the hyphae, they secrete digestive enzymes into the external environment. So they secrete their digestion enzymes outside of their cells. Those enzymes then go to work breaking down whatever is around them, whether it's minerals or dead plants or dead organisms or bacteria or whatever's around them. Fungi can digest a huge, wide range of molecules. Those enzymes break down those molecules into smaller pieces, and then the hyphae cells absorb those nutrients after they've been broken down. Okay, so they're a really huge component to establishing life on land because, one, they don't absorb back everything that those enzymes are digesting. There's a lot of stuff that those enzymes break down that the fungi don't reabsorb, which then become available for other organisms, right? So why they're called the recyclers of an ecosystem. The other key component is that fungi can digest inorganic material like rocks, right, in order to break that down to get their carbon and to get their energy, right? So fungi are a key component to creating soil, which plants need to put their roots in, right? They're also a key component of extracting nutrients out of this really rocky kind of sandy substrate that the terrestrial parts of Earth would have been at this point in time. So the majority of a body of a fungus is going to be it's usually below ground or inside of whatever it's eating is going to be this hyphae, which groups of hyphae together we call mycelium. So that's most of what a fungi is. 99% of the body of a fungi we don't even see. And usually the parts that we see that come up above ground, like this mushroom right here, those are the fruiting bodies, the reproductive structures, right? Most of the body of a fungi is these hyphae, these mycelium. In fact, the oldest and the largest organism on our planet is the fungi. It's here in Oregon, too. How cool is that? It's a honey mushroom. It's in like southeastern Oregon-ish. So, yeah, pretty amazing organisms. So fungi are in the same lineages as us, animals, the Opisthokonts. They're more closely related to us than they are to plants. And we think that very beginning of kind of life on Earth would have been like the scum green film that would have coated some of the kind of the shores, if you would, in the early parts of colonizing land. Mostly a mix of cyanobacteria, maybe some algae, and some unicellular fungi, kind of like this, the nuclearids, right? So these are a type of protist that we think is kind of the sister taxon of fungi. They're unicellular protists that eat bacteria and other microorganisms, other protists, right? So they're heterotrophic. And they share a lot of characteristics with fungi as well. Okay, so we think that that's kind of how it all worked, that these early nuclearids kind of were munching on cyanobacteria or maybe some algae that was around, and a group of them branched off and developed into multicellular fungi that were totally terrestrial. Okay, so that's kind of our hypothesis of how this started. So some of the key adaptations that fungi have for land, one of them being their hyphae, the huge network of those cells that they use for feeding. And that's what most of the body of a fungi is, okay? Each single strand is just one cell thick, but they clump together oftentimes so densely that we can't see it just as one cell. So for example, I was growing some oyster mushrooms over the summer, which is super easy, but the way you start is basically you take little chunks of Hyphae from another source, put them in with a food source, in this case I use wood chips, and then give them some water and let them go, okay? So all this fluffy white stuff, that's all mycelium, which are tiny, tiny little threads of Hyphae all together. So Hyphae are the small threads, mycelium together is what we would call this. So the reason why this is important is because it creates a very large surface area for fungi to absorb materials, okay? So often we will see kind of a theme throughout our class that surface area is key. The larger surface area you have, the more material you can move into and out of your body at a time, okay? So this is one of their key components, is their hyphae, allow them to expand and to reach and to find new areas where there could be food available for them. The other key component that is really helpful for fungi existing on land is chitin. So chitin is a polymer of glucose, kind of related to cellulose that we saw in plants, and we find it in the cell wall of the fungal cells. So it's a polymer that provides a really flexible strength to those fungal cells. And the reason why this is important is because fungi will often, as they're reabsorbing those nutrients that their digestive enzymes broke down, water will come with it because osmosis. And so fungal cells will often hydrate and then dehydrate, hydrate and then dehydrate. They'll change size relatively rapidly. And without this kind of flexible cell wall, this chitinous cell wall, they would basically burst open. So this chitin allows them to absorb nutrients and water at the same time, kind of inflate but not burst, and then it can shrink back down. Okay, and chitin, we will see it again once we get to the arthropods. It evolved again independently, so it's an analogous structure that we find in the arthropods, and the exoskeleton of arthropods. So what makes the exoskeleton of insects so rigid is chitin, the same molecule. In fact, chitin is so flexible but also strong that there's some people that are looking to use chitin, or fungi really, as a building material. Okay, in some studies it's been shown to be stronger than concrete, so we could actually use fungi mycelium to make building material. How awesome is that? Like the most eco-friendly building material ever. That's kind of what's going on here. This one's actually still alive, so we actually still got some budding going on, some mushrooms coming up. But we can form it into bricks and then build it like we would a house. Pretty cool, huh? So different groups of fungi. We don't have a whole lot of time in our class to kind of dive into the different groups of fungi. There's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different species of fungi, and we can kind of break them up in these 5 groups. Some people might say that this would be a polytomy here. Some people say that we've completely resolved it. It's still kind of up in the air, but regardless, we group fungi based on their reproductive structures. And we've been doing that for a long time, but then we found some fungi that don't sexually reproduce, and they don't go through any sort of sexual reproduction like we find in these other groups. So we went back to DNA, sequenced the DNA, and found out that yes, this grouping based on reproduction does work, and those that don't go through sexual reproduction, we can use their DNA to kind of put them into one of these 5 groups here. Okay, so that's how we establish these. We're probably somewhat familiar with a lot of these. So starting at kind of the bottom here, these are considered kind of more ancient fungi, I guess you could say, the chytrids. These are fungi that still have motile spores, so their spores can swim, okay, which is not common in most fungi. Most fungi, their spores, when they reproduce, do not have flagella, but chytrids do. Chytrids, you may have heard them come up in the news because they are a fungi that is infecting amphibians. And basically what they do is they spread through water, because they can swim, and they'll infect the skin of the amphibian. And as we'll learn later, amphibians use their skin in part for respiration, for gas exchange. But when it's infected with chytrid fungus, they start to basically thicken their skin, and the thicker their skin is, the less gas they can exchange. So chytrid fungus infections are pathogenic to a lot of amphibians and are one of the causes, combined with global warming and humans just being terrible, that we're losing a lot of our amphibian species. Zygomycota, probably have come across these. If you ever found moldy bread, or your fruit's gotten moldy, your vegetables gotten moldy, any sort of mold that grows on stuff in your fridge or in your kitchen is probably Zygomycota. So these are their reproductive structures. Here's Zygomycotis, this is the hyphae, and then this would be what we call their sporangium, where they send out their spores right here. And that's usually what we see when we see the mold, that bluish color to it, or like greenish color. You're usually seeing the sporangium structure of Zygomycota. Glomeromycetes. So side note again, the myco or mice, that just means fungi. So mycology is the study of fungi, okay? Or a mycophile is somebody that loves fungi. So glomeromycetes, these are obligate mycorrhizal fungi. So we, for a long time, didn't know that they existed until we discovered them growing as mycorrhizal fungi, and they will basically only grow as mycorrhizal fungi. They're basically obligate mycorrhizal fungi. So they will create that symbiotic relationship with plant cells, where they depend on the plant cells to provide sugar from photosynthesis for an energy source, and then they trade the plant nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, all that stuff that it breaks down from the external environment. Plants will often spend upwards of 20%, if not more, of all of the sugars that they produce on photosynthesis feeding their mycorrhizal fungi buddies. So very codependent, you could say. Ascomycetes, we categorize these based on their cup structure. So asco means cup, mycete meaning fungus, basically. A famous member of this is the moral fungi. People go crazy for morals. It's like a big one people are always looking for. But there's many different types of cup fungi, and they have some sort of fruiting structure that usually looks like a cup, but not always. And then this group, I'm sure we're probably all familiar with these, the basidiomycetes. These are the more traditional mushrooms that you would eat or buy at a grocery store. Shiitakes, white button mushrooms, things like that would be the basidiomycetes. They produce their offspring, their spores, basically on the underside, on the gills of a mushroom. So if you cut open a mushroom and you kind of see those like brown gills, that's where the spores are coming out. Okay, and that's how they reproduce. That's how they send off to the next generation. So just a word to the wise though, don't eat any fungi that you find unless you're with a professional that can identify it for you. Just don't go eating random fungi. Just probably a good life lesson there. Okay. So fungi, like we said, we often characterize them by how they reproduce and their reproductive structures. Fungi go through this really bizarre reproduction cycle. We thought plants were weird, fungi are even weirder. And so basically fungi will have what we call mating types, positive and negative. Here I have them labeled as blue and red, okay? But basically it's just kind of a way for fungi to determine the genetic relatedness between two different individuals of the same species. So two opposite mating types will come together. We don't use male or female because male and female implies that there are gametes produced, and male gametes are small, female gametes are large. There are no gametes produced in fungi. They do not produce sperm or eggs, there's no gametes. But what happens is we get two separate mating types come about, okay, opposite mating types, plus or minus. Parts of their hyphae will fuse together. They literally fuse their cells together in what we call the process of plasmogamy. So gamy meaning to marry, plasma meaning the cytoplasm of their cells. So plasmogamy, they marry their cells together, but their nuclei remain separate. So the nuclei where the DNA is remain separate. So that creates what we call a dikaryotic stage. So karyo meaning nucleus, di meaning two. So after plasmogamy, we get cells, hyphae, that have two nuclei from different organisms. Okay, this is bizarre, right? So they have two nuclei, each are haploid. So typically fungi hyphae are already haploid. now you have what we call N plus N, 2 haploid nuclei in the same cell, but they haven't joined their DNA yet. Fungi can stay like this forever, for years. There's some fungi that just exist in this stage. But under certain environmental conditions, they'll go through sexual reproduction. Basically what that means, they don't produce gametes, but on some of these cells, these 2 different nuclei will fuse together to create a diploid nuclei. So I did it red and blue, so now red and blue combined together is purple. So this cell right here now is going to be diploid. Remember, each of these individually are haploid. So something triggered karyogamy, nuclei marrying, is what that means. So now that those 2 nuclei fuse together into one. Okay, that's key because now this cell is diploid. And remember, diploid cells can go through meiosis, but not haploid cells. So now this diploid cell right here can go through meiosis to produce 4 haploid cells that are each genetically unique, that have a combination of each of the red and the blue DNA. Because meiosis mix up the genetics, right? So karyogamy, this diploid cell, then goes through meiosis to produce these haploid spores, which can then get sent out into the environment. And then these haploid spores go through mitosis to produce new hyphae, new mycelium, and the whole thing starts over again. Bonkers, right? Super weird. It can stay like this for a long time too. It can stay dikaryotic for a long time. Fungi are bizarre organisms, but they run our planet. They really, we would not be here without fungi. They keep us alive. So yeah, fungi sex, weird stuff, but hey, it's been working for them for a few billion years. Gotta be something to it. But how they get those spores out, there's some really, really cool adaptations in fungi for how they get their spores out, because that's the name of the game, right? You want to get those offspring out and away from you so that way they can go colonize new areas and you won't compete with them. Most of the interesting structures that we find in fungi are for getting their spores out, right? So this little puffball fungi, those are all the spores. Look, it uses raindrops to kind of create this poof, the energy to get its spores out, and then those carry out on the wind, right? So we see a lot of adaptations where the spores are really small and really light because they can be carried by wind, as opposed to if they were living in the water. They wouldn't have to be as small and light, right? These guys are cool. These actually create osmotic pressure inside of their fruiting bodies. I think this is a type of Zygomycota, where the osmotic pressure can get so intense it basically shoots off at the speed of firing a gun, and so they can shoot it way, 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 way far away from themselves. Okay, so it's basically launching its offspring off in a cannon. But most of what we think of as mushrooms, like the Basidiomycota, the kind that pop up in our yards, their gills underneath are where their spores are being distributed, and then the wind will come by and they'll carry them away. Okay, but there's a whole host of unique adaptations of fungi using insects, using lots of different types of adaptations for getting their spores out and away from them. So I wish we could talk more about fungi. I obviously love it. If you're interested, there's a documentary on Netflix called Fantastic Fungi. Pretty cool. So yeah, just a little plug for that documentary right there.